Alrighty, folks, welcome back to Hotel Evening and Weekend Platoon. Today is going to be week 8, day 3, and we're going to get back into APIs a little bit. So we'll start off by just doing a little bit of review about what APIs are, why we need, how we can access them using JavaScript, what things we need to keep in mind when doing so, and after that, we'll then start designing a web application that accesses some resources that an API provides. But more specifically, that then also adds in a degree of interactivity to it. So, super uh, initial question, what is an API?
It's an application programming interface.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Cisco. Now, Cisco or anyone else, what does that mean in human English terms?
It's a database.
Okay, anyone else?
It's a dynamic JSON that allows you to access the data for your website.
Yeah, so it's kind of like an entry portal that you can use in order to get data that exists somewhere else and bring it back to your application to use it. Sometimes you may be able to edit the data on the other side. Other times you might only be able to access it or access certain parts of it. So, and that goes back to the different types of methods that we can use when retrieving information or accessing an API. What are some different types of methods we can use when interacting with APIs? Do you guys remember? So what's the main basic thing that we do with an API?
Uh, you can create, read, update, and delete.
Okay, yep, that is true. I guess let me rephrase my question. What are the different types of requests that you can make to an API? And Cisco, that's
Are
exactly
you
correct. But yeah, Adam, go ahead.
are you talking about fetch?
That, yeah, keep going. So what is fetch?
Uh,
I thought it was just pulling the API into whatever you're working on right now.
Okay, yeah. So fetch is a JavaScript library that you can use to deal with an API. Um, so when we run a default fetch, like when we just say fetch from an API, what type of a request is it using or is it doing?
it's a GET request.
It's a GET request. Perfect. So a GET request is the default type of request when you're accessing an API. That just says, hey, just give me information. What other types of requests are there? If you guys remember. This is something that we played around with a little bit in Postman. So not too much, but just a tad. Anyone remember the other types of, or some other types of requests?
So you have put,
Mhm.
there's a put request, and then you have a post and get put post. And I guess there's some form of delete. I forget what it
Yep,
is though.
it's just delete.
Okay.
So if we go to Postman very briefly, let me pull this up. So this is that weather at, or the JSON placeholder that we dealt with along like when was this Saturday now? You guys, hopefully you guys remember that we messed around a little bit with this. So you can send a request, you can get back a bunch of JSON, right? So the default request, the thing that'll show up if you hit plus, is a get request. That's the default fetch. So the get is equivalent to read in CRUD. A post request is equivalent to creating. You are adding some data to whatever repository you're accessing with your API. So we did create, we did read. Um, Update is usually going to be a put request or a patch request where you're updating or putting some data in there to replace some existing ones. And can anyone tell me what corresponds to delete in CRUD?
Delete.
Delete. Yep, delete does the delete. Super simple. So create is going to be your post, update is put or patch, read is get, delete is delete. So that's again, we're not going to get too much into these functionalities right now, but it's good to keep in mind, especially as we start getting more into excuse me, databases and data retrieval from APIs more in the coming weeks. All right. So we talked a little bit about APIs. Let's get to coding. So, and then I'll ask you a few more questions once we pivot over to the JavaScript. So today's goal is I need to here, let me just create a text and let me just copy paste in the requirements for today's website. So we need to make a website that does a couple of things. So to make a website that has a button on it, when you click the button, we need to be able to pull in a bunch of users from this website over here. So we'll take a look at that in a second. And when I see the list of users, I want to be able to click the same button to remove all the users. And then I want to be able to do this as many times as I want. Not sure why, but that's what someone is paying us to do. So we have to do it. So where do I start?
Create the button.
All right. So but before we do that,
Create the
so let's
HTML page.
okay. I guess I was thinking, well, sure, so I guess let's go just to be clear. So what you're suggesting, let's say path forward is going to be one, right? HTML page. And then after that, move to JavaScript.
Yeah.
Is there anything we need to do between writing our HTML page and writing our JavaScript code?
Well, I guess it may help to go to the API and look and see how we're gonna utilize it first and foremost.
That is good. Yep. So let's say look at API and see what it returns and what format it returns things in. There's one more step that I want us to do before we start writing code.
Oh,
Anyone other than Cisco for this one? Because it sounds like you realized it.
Do you mean pseudocode?
I do mean pseudocode. Yes,
good
this is
job,
the
Adam.
most important step. So it's kind of you can pseudocode your HTML, but that's not really pseudocoding. That's like making a mock web page. So if you've ever seen people like go into PowerPoint and start drawing blocks for, ooh, here's where I want to put a nav bar, here's where I want to put the images, blah, 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 blah. That's mock web pages are similar to pseudocoding for HTML. In this case, we don't need to do that because all we need to do on our website is put a button and that's about it. Not much of a mock web page needs to be made there. However, in future, I will write this down as like a step 0 is create a mock web page. So you just sketch out what you want your website to look like on paper, PowerPoint, Microsoft Paint, if you choose. Like those are all ways that people usually will start with by making their HTML. So, all right, let's jump over to our HTML page. So we're gonna set that this is a doc type HTML, and we'll add some opening and closing tags. Let's see, what else do we want to do? Probably need a header, and we'll add in a body. All right, so what stuff usually goes in a header? Nicole, why don't you give me one thing that goes in the header?
The title?
Title. All right, so let's say API button website. All right. Adam, give me another one.
Oh, what else but a title would go in the header?
This
I
is
don't
a
know.
good question, and this is a valid question. Um, I will say the things that I'm looking for can go anywhere, but usually they're placed in the header. Art, go ahead.
Some meta tags.
Okay, we could add meta tags. We will not be doing that today because it's a little bit it doesn't look pretty, but usually you do add meta tags, that's correct.
Well, you could add, if you're going to use CSS, you can a style sheet, you can put CSS in it, or optionally you can put a script tag in there, but it's it's good practice to put the script tag at the bottom.
So sometimes you'll see it at the bottom, sometimes you'll see it up in the header.
Right.
But yeah, that's correct. So usually people will put in your style sheet in the header, so that way you don't have to bother about it being anywhere else. And usually I like to put my scripts in the header as well. But again, like Cisco mentioned, you don't have to do that. You can put them elsewhere as well. So for starters, I'll keep the style blank, and for the script, I'll just say that my source is going to be, what is this, app.js. That's about it. And we'll leave that in the header for now. All right, so for the body, let's see. Well, the only thing we need to do is add our button. Just to be a decent human being and not feel like a terrible person, I'm just going to add in like a nice little header and some, or header text and describe the page. This is an API button, and we'll add in a break return. And then we'll say something like this is an H3. When you click the button below, users will appear. Then we'll add in another break return. And then now we can add in our button, and we'll call this uh, show users. And then, is there anything else that we should add to this page? If we go back to our functionality here, which I'll drop in on this side, is there anything else we need to add?
Yeah. We want to create a list of users to the page.
All right,
So,
so Cisco, let's stop there.
uh-huh.
So, Adam, uh, as our new HTML guru, how can we go about preparing the web page for a list to be inserted? Or I guess firstly, let me ask, is there anywhere on this page right now where a list can be inserted using JavaScript?
Right under the button, show users button.
Okay. But so what do we need to write in HTML so that JavaScript can access it to insert our list?
Well, wouldn't we need to call something from the JavaScript page, and the JavaScript would pull in the API?
Sure. That's not incorrect. But let's take two steps back. So right now, if I show you the page, which looks pretty decent, we don't have a space necessarily on the page for where the list is going to show up. Right? So when we are trying to modify a page using JavaScript, we have to access an HTML element somehow. So what HTML element do we want to access in order to add in that list of users?
I don't know what it's called, but it's kind it's like a box where you can put things. That sounds dumb.
Nope, that's correct.
Um,
It's a container.
yeah, container. There you go. That was the word.
Do you remember what the name of the container is? Or if anyone else wants to jump in to help out.
Div.
Div. Perfect. So do I just want to leave it like that and just say it's a nameless div?
No.
No.
No. Okay, what do I need to do in order to make this something that JavaScript can use?
All right.
Say that one more time, Joe. I think you cut out.
Declare it. So
Okay.
do like ID equals container or something.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's say ID equals list container. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Okay, and we can just say, I'm just gonna put in something like list placeholder in there for now, just so it shows up. So if we preview our website, you see that indeed list placeholder shows up right below our button. So now, sort of like Art was saying, the next steps, or sorry, Adam, the next steps would be in JavaScript, we can now access this div by its ID and modify its contents. All right, there is one thing, however, that I don't like about this website. This is really ugly. It's Times New Roman, 12-point font or bigger. Like it's really generic and not fun. So we can change that. We can go down the rabbit hole of looking up background colors and fonts and spacing and make our own CSS style sheet, which is going to take us 2 hours or more because if you're like me, you really, really, really like messing around with style sheets. And that takes up all your time and energy. We are not going to do that today because our lecture is not about CSS style sheets. Instead, we're going to be talking a little bit about something called Bootstrap. Has anyone heard of this before?
Yes.
Okay, Cisco, tell us about it.
Love it, love it, love it. Bootstrap is a framework that you can use to quickly build HTML sites through the use of different components, uh, uh, declaring, using certain classes, stylistic classes that they offer in order to, style your web page and content. And it just
That's
makes it a lot easier and faster than trying to do it, from scratch.
Indeed it does. So Bootstrap is, you can think of it as a CSS library. So if you guys remember back when we were doing the Python unit, we had to install and import third-party libraries sometimes to do different things. Bootstrap is kind of like that, but for CSS. So it imports a bunch of nice styling that some folks have already made. That comes with a bunch of other things as well. We're not going to mess with that today, but what I would like to show you is the pre-made styling. So I just copy pasted in this massive link, which comes directly from the Bootstrap website itself. So if we go to the curriculum page, see here that says one of these is Bootstrap, you click the link, it takes you to their documentation, which is pretty good in my opinion. And then for a quick start, you have to copy paste this link in here into the header, which is how you link to an external style sheet using the link feature. So not script. So if we take a look now and we save our web page and we run it, we see here that the font is completely different, and so is the button. So there are other variants of Bootstrap and more detailed ways to configure it and things like that if you want to do things like dark mode or different fonts and spacings and things like that. But it drastically will improve your format. So highly recommend using Bootstrap and getting into it and learning about it on your own time because it is something very valuable. But for right now, we're just going to use it as an external style sheet. So any questions about that before we get to get to the coding. All right, go ahead.
You know what worries me about relying on external links is sometimes those links are removed or changed. And it looks super unprofessional when like somebody clicks on your website and they find a bunch of broken links. Is there a way to save save the style? So almost like in a Docker file, like where like you bring everything with you. So like if that link actually is broken later down, it doesn't like destroy your website.
That's a very good question. A lot of large software packages, or very widely used ones, like Bootstrap or Pandas for Python, or Fetch, etc., those will usually be backwards compatible. So, in other words, all of the previous versions that exist still stay up and still work, even if those are not being actively maintained. For smaller libraries, though, like you mentioned, those might go down. Let's say if someone just decides they don't want to update it anymore, or if they don't want to pay money for the web hosting service, or they don't have time, or something like that. And so you might go on one day and say, why isn't this feature working? Oh, that library is deprecated. So you can, it's like in this case of CSS, you can go to like the Bootstrap link here, and I'll just show you what that looks like in a second. So this is the Bootstrap CSS link. You can see it's really, really long. These are, I mean, this is everything that Bootstrap includes. It's just a CSS file. So hypothetically, you can hit Control S or Command S and save this on your computer and import it in if you really want to. However, in general, most folks usually will just reference the original link on the web. But it is possible to do to answer your question. Other questions? All right, so we've done step 0, we've done step 1. Now we need to look at our API and see what it returns. So our API is referencing this thing. So let's go to Postman. And here I'm gonna close out of this, close out of that, and we'll add in a new GET request, have this link. So let's see what happens when we run this. All right, so we get a bunch of information. So when I run this, it looks like we get, so this looks like an individual user. And we can tell that because so the square brackets are sort of the highest level opening and closing. So if you go inside there, usually you want to look for something whose ID is 1. In general, that'll be like the largest unit. So this whole thing is a user. So it gives us information about their name, username, email, blah, 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 address, and company. But all good stuff to know. Now, we don't necessarily need to display all of this information about the user. So let's say the only information, I'm going to write this down in my little notepad. So here, let's go back to my notes. So the needed information is probably going to be, let's say, the user's name. Probably want to have their username and maybe let's add in their city. We'll keep it simple. So 3 fields. So let's go back to our where did you go? Our Postman, and think about how we can access that. So the name is pretty simple. It's just going to be the JSON placeholder name thing dot name, and then dot username for their username. How can I get their city from this JSON code? Let's call the JSON code like a placeholder, like JSON placeholder. How can I get the city that they're in? from this construction.
But you basically have a dictionary within a dictionary, so you would just have to follow that path down.
Okay.
Maybe address/city.
Yes, perfect. So let's go back to our code or here. So is this just going to be the field for that I think was just the name, username, username, and the city, like you said, is going to be the address and then address dot city. Okay, so now sounds like a really good time to start moving on to our pseudocode. So let's do that. So let's start off by thinking about what our code needs to do. So what do we need to be able to do overall? Well, firstly, we need to be able to, so when button is clicked, display list of users. But when button is clicked, we also need to be able to remove all the users. So this makes me think, well, I can't display the users and remove them at the same time. So I should probably define a variable or something somewhere that says whether my button has been clicked or not. So let's say I'm just going to define it as a variable for now. So say is clicked, and we'll say that that is false when the page loads. And we'll say this tracks whether the button has been clicked. So let's not do the last one until the end, because that'll hopefully be easier. And let's just focus on when the button is clicked, displaying the list of users. Anyone want to talk me through how we can get that? Yeah, this is just pseudocode, so we're not writing actual code out just yet.
Is this where you
First,
like add one of those? Oh, I'm sorry. So go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
Okay. I was going to guess, so maybe don't go far. The uh, this is like where you add one of those like event listeners, like click on click something like that.
Yep. So let's do that, right? So let's define a let's do a button listener since we have a button anyway. Um, and we'll put an event listener in there. So we'll get so we'll have to access the button. And then what we can do now is we can say event listener, it will be when button is clicked, do something. And then we'll probably want a window on load. And then we'll add the button listener. So that way, when we load into the website, it'll automatically add in our button listener to the button. So when it's clicked, it can do something. So, all right, let's do the first part. So accessing the button. Joe, how do we access the button? I'll open the HTML on the side so we can see it.
Thank you. I guess would it be from, no, the ID is going to be the list container. I don't know, man.
All
Need some
right.
help, Joe?
Yeah, man, I do.
No, Cisco, you helped too much. We need to give you a break, otherwise you're going to be the instructor.
long day, dude.
All right. Well, Nicole, do you want to jump in and help us out?
Sure. You have to do the document dot get element by ID
Okay.
and put in the what's the ID? Listener dash container with
All
the
right.
quote.
So, how many of us think that? So, Nicole, I would say you're on the right track, and that is 90% correct.
Okay.
However, I'm going to throw this to everyone except Nicole, and Nicole as well. Well, what element are we accessing when we access list container? Are we accessing the button itself? All right, Cisco, now you can jump in.
So you're accessing the div with the ID list container.
Yeah.
So that list placeholder is what you're accessing, not the button.
If we wanted to access the button, though, what we could always do is we can add an ID to the button. That's just button. And then we would just change this get element by ID to be button. And then that would work. The other way that we could do this is we could also do a document dot query select and do it of type button. So the difference is that a query selector will basically go through your index.html file or whatever file and return the first element that has essentially this type to it. So again, a button, the type of element that is in HTML is just button. And we only have one button. So document.querySelector button will return the only button on the web page. That works well if you have a unique element. Like again, this query selector is only looking for buttons, and we only have one button. If we have 5 buttons on the page, this is not a good idea because it can't target unique elements as easily as you can when getting them by ID. So let's go with Nicole's method of accessing the button by its ID. So thank you for that. All right, next part is going to be the event listener. So when the button is clicked, we want to do something. Let's see. Adam, how do I add an event listener within this or an on click?
I'm gonna be honest with you, the syntax is lost on me. I understand the concept a lot better, but the syntax is something I usually copy and paste.
Okay, fair enough. I will say I do the same thing. Or you can just hit tab, and usually that works. Okay, doesn't look that like that worked. So, guess what? I forgot too, so somebody else is gonna have to teach me what the format of the on click is. Art, you want to give it a shot?
Let me see the on click. I don't know the exact syntax, but I think the on click is going to direct it to the actual API.
So that's taking a couple steps ahead, but yes, that is what we're going to do later. So I'm gonna write this down. Need to access the API stuff. So let's think about that short. The only thing that I'm thinking about right now is what is the formatting of the
Is,
on click or the formatting of an event listener in general.
is it it's like almost like a fat, I guess it is a fat arrow function. So equals and then in parentheses E, then the
Yep.
fat arrow, curly braces, E dot target, do stuff here. Yeah, that's basically the same. E dot target dot inner text.
No, you're not supposed to be reading the curriculum page
Hey,
while doing this.
you're asking for answers. I'm getting them for you. I'm trying to read this to figure out what the hell I'm doing here.
Well,
I'm
that's what
trying
happens. But yeah, so E dot, so let's see. So Can you tell me what E.target is doing?
No.
All right. Now it's open season. Who can tell me what E.target is doing?
I thought the E stood for execute, and it's trying to execute uh like it's trying to point you to what it wants to execute. No?
Kind of. So E is the event that happens.
Same.
Yeah,
No.
so E basically is grabbing the event that it's attached to, and it's grabbing the target of the event, and then the target has different parameters that you can change or modify after you grab that target through the
Perfect.
event.
Thank you, Cisco. So the event here is that the mouse has been clicked. The target is what did the mouse click on? In this case, it's essentially, we know it's the button, but the formal way to do it is by saying E.target. And then the button has an inner text property that we can then change, as Joe artfully put, change it to clicked. In addition to that, though, we also want to access API, or we also want this to trigger displaying of users. However, right now, my main priority is making sure that this button thingy works. So let's go ahead and show a preview. When I click it, it does indeed say clicked. So our event listener worked, part one. Okay, so let's get back to our pseudocode. So the next thing that Art mentioned is that we now need to figure out how to get our data from the API. So before we display the users, what we realistically have to do is we're going to need to get user data from API, display that data. And so that's a two-step process. So first, let's figure out how to get the data from the API. This goes back to fetch, which is the thing that we went over a little while ago. Can someone talk me through how we can design a function that can return output from an API? What's the state? What is the process we need to go through? Okay, so first off, let me ask a leading question. What type of function is this?
An async,
Why is it an async function? You're correct.
because while it's going to run this function, but before it actually processes it, it has to go through the list of everything that follows it. So it's basically happening concurrently. I'm not sure if that's a good way to describe it.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. JavaScript will basically just go through all the commands at once. If it takes you half an hour to get data from your API, and then you need that data to get fed into something else, you need to make sure to tell your API or to tell your code, you need to wait before you keep moving on to running the other stuff. You need this data to come in first. So that's why we have to wrap it in an async. The other half of it, which I was originally going to ask, but I kind of gave away the answer, is everything else that happens relating to our API in here needs to be wrapped in an await. So let's start this off. Let's say we have our get request. We're just making a simple get request. Is we're now going to await fetching from, let's see, where's our link? And I'm going to, I absolutely hate hard coding things into my API calls. So what I'll do all the way at the top is I'm going to say, let's see, const API source. And I'm going to just define that here. This is going to be source of link to API. So we're just going to fetch from my API source. So that way, let's say that our link changes later on, we can just go to the top and change the link, and our code should, in theory, keep working. All right, so what is GET request? Like, what data type is this? Is this going to be JSON data?
Don't you have to turn it into JSON?
We do have to turn it into JSON. Perfect. So let's say, let's call this response body, and we need to await to turn it into JSON as well. So we'll say get request dot JSON. Right here, I'm just going to call this get request response. It's a bit better. So again, we need to wait in order to get the JSON out due to the reasons that we just mentioned. The last thing we need to do now is finally just return the response body. Okay, great. So super easy. I guess now the only thing that we need to do is to get that user data is say something like user data equals get users from API. And then this holds user data in JSON. And that's it, right? Is there any change that I need to make to my button listener function in order to do this? Or am I okay? Okay, show of hands. Who thinks that this code itself should work? All right, I'm not seeing very many hands up. Nicole, you did not raise your hand. Why do you think that this code will not work? And don't say it's because of the way I asked the question.
Just by looking at right now, you're, I don't know, you're not referencing user data anywhere. So I see
Okay.
when they're not highlighted out, something's wrong.
That's part of it. And I will fix that right now.
Okay, I was like,
I got one. If I'm not mistaken, it's the order of your functions. So get users from API needs to go above that before you can actually call it and add button listener.
All right,
Otherwise, it'll say get user get user API is not defined or something like that.
that's true. There is one more little error with this.
In const user data, do you have to await the get users from
Yeah.
Close. Well, actually, well, yes. One of them is that we have to await it.
Yeah.
Why do we have to await get users from API?
Because you actually need to also do an async before the events on button on click.
Exactly. So, and remember, an await can only go inside of an async. And that's exactly what this error says here. Await expressions are only allowed within async functions. So we now need to change our onClick to be an async function. We do not need to make the entire button listener an async function, just the onClick event listener. Only reason that we need to make it async is because we're waiting for our users from the API. Perfect. All right, good. So now this code should actually work. So I'm going to, once again, go to my index.html, pop it open. Here, let me actually pop this open in my browser so that we can see the console logs. All right, can everyone see my browser now?
Mhm.
All right, perfect. Let's go to console. We have no console logs right now. If I click this, we do indeed get something that's been console logged. That sure looks like JSON to me. And that looks like a dictionary. We have each of these things is a user, right? So we've got an ID, the name, the username, the address, and their company. That's perfect. So we've gotten all our information out via the console log, which is exactly what we wanted to happen. So again, the main things to keep in mind is you need to, if you're getting something back from something that is an async function, you need to await it. And if you're awaiting something, that has to be wrapped in an async. So this should all hopefully be mostly reviewed. All right, so now there's a couple of other things that we need to do. So obviously, as we mentioned, we've gotten the user data. However, it's kind of useless to, I mean, what we could do is we could display the user data in that very ugly format of a dictionary on the HTML page. That's a really bad idea because that looks terrible. So the next thing we need to do now is we need to format that data a little bit more. So let's design another function to do that. So let's call this create user element. And this is going to take in, let's say, an individual user, and it's going to do stuff. More specifically, I'm going to write down a little description for this function. So this function takes in a JSON for an individual user and returns a properly formatted div containing the user's information. So let's go back to our notes. So these are the three things that we need to extract from our dictionary. There's the user's name, their username, and their city. Now that's going to be somewhere inside of our user JSON. How can we get this out?
We're gonna have to declare each of those things separately. So div
Okay.
name and what was the other one? Email.
Yeah, so, or let's see. Is that name, username, and their city?
Oh, sorry.
Okay. So let's just do that. So can I just say name equals name, or do I have to pull name from somewhere?
You would have to. Well, you'd have to do const name, right?
That's
Const
true.
equals document. I don't remember the rest of it.
So again, right now we're not doing anything in the dot. The only thing that we're doing is we're saying, given a bunch of JSON, how can I pull out the name and the username from it?
Would it be a response body dot name?
It would be if we were taking in response body. In this case, we're taking in user. So it would just be user.name. So again, think of user, if we go back to the browser, think of user, so the response body is going to be this whole mess of like everything. Let's just think of user as being one of these. So it would be user.name, and then you'd get Leanne or whoever these other people are. And we can apply the exact same process to get the username, which is user.username, which it's actually not really great because you have user username. That just sounds weird, but all right. And then the last thing we want to do is get the city out, which will be, as we said previously, user and then dot address dot city. I think Cisco was or I don't remember who was referring to the nested dictionaries, and that's where this comes in. Okay, so now we have the name, the username, and the city, but these are not HTML elements. So what we need to do is we need to transform those into HTML elements. So let's do that. So let's first say that we're going to extract user information from JSON into variables. The next thing we need to do is we're going to create div, or the div that holds user information, put user information into the div, and then return our div. So let's create a div. How do you create a div in JavaScript?
Div dot.
Elaborate.
No, no, I'm just trying. I don't know. I'm just guessing here.
Okay, that's all right. So let's first define it as a const div.
Mhm.
Does anyone remember how we create an element in an HTML? How do we create an HTML element using JavaScript?
Using the create element function for the document.
Perfect. Yes.
Document dot create element here,
So
right?
whenever you're manipulating something with a DOM, you always want to start out with document. Then we're going to go ahead and just hit create element. As it says here, it'll create an instance of the element for the specified tag. And in this case, we're going to create a div. Within that div, let's go ahead and create a couple of things. So we can say const, say name tag is going to be create element. Let's make that an H2. I'll say username tag, create element data p tag, and then we'll also create a city tag that's also going to be a p tag. So now we have our different divs in our elements created. So the only things that we need to do is now add in that user information. So now this goes to the div dot or name tag dot notation. So if I wanted to update the text inside of name tag, I do name tag dot text content, which again is the text that goes inside of the H2. That's equal to name. Let's say username tag dot text content is username, and then city tag dot text content is the city. So lastly, Nicole will probably notice this, but I actually never ended up using the div, which is why its color is slightly grayed out. So the one thing I could do is I could just return div, but that div is going to be blank because I never added any children to it. I never put anything inside the div. So before we return the div, we should probably fill the div with user information elements. The way we can do that is by appending children. So we'll append a child, and we'll add on the name tag first. We'll then append child the username tag. And then lastly, we will append the city tag. And now when we return it, the div has been filled with the name, the username, and the city. Notice that this is a normal fat arrow function. We are not making this an async function, and we don't have any awaits inside. The reason for that is because we're just taking in JSON data. We're not taking in a promise or a response or anything like that. We're just taking in JSON. So for that, you don't need an async or an await. This is just a normal function. But is it clear how we went from a JSON input to returning a div? Questions about that? Or does that all make sense? Okay, so just for time's purposes, because lecture's gone on for almost an hour, we are not going to work on the delete function today, but that is written on the curriculum page that you're more than welcome to check out if you want to. The last thing that I do want us to do, however, is I would like us to be able to get that button working. So when we click the button, it displays the users. So what have we done so far? We figured out how to get our users from our API. We figured out how to create a user element for an individual user. And we know how to do stuff when a button is clicked. What remains in order for us to get this button working? What do we need to do to display the user data?
we need to we basically need to get the we need to get the list of users, iterate through them, and then populate them to the HTML page.
Perfect. So I heard you say iterate. Sounds like a for loop. And just for that, I'm going to create a brand new function because I don't like creating very complicated functions if we can break them out. So let's go ahead and define a, what do I want to call this? Let's call this draw users. And this is going to take in all of our users, and this is going to display them on the page. So takes in a JSON file of users. It's going to iterate. So that's the input. And I think, like you said, we're going to iterate through the users. For each user, turn each user into a div, and then put each div on the main page. That's about it. So iterate through the users. What does iteration mean? I said it like a minute ago.
Loop.
Loop. Perfect. All right. So let's do a for, let's just make this be like let user of users, right? So this is equivalent in Python for user in users. Same thing. So the other thing I need to remember is this is JavaScript formatting, even though I don't like JavaScript formatting. So we need to use curly brackets everywhere. So for each user, I want to turn each user into a div. I just wrote a function to do that. It takes in a user and returns a properly formatted div. So let's define this as const user div. And we'll say this is going to be create user element of user. So now we're using user. And now the only thing we need to do is put each div on the main page. How do we add something to our main page in HTML? Any ideas?
Uh, yeah. So so you're gonna grab the. Can you show me can you show me the HTML page again?
Sure.
Okay, so when you say main page, are you
So
speaking of the body
we
part
want to
or
add it to the list placeholder.
okay. So you can grab it by the ID list container if
Right?
you like.
So let's write that down in pseudocode. We're going
Mhm.
to grab give with ID of that.
Mhm. And yeah, then you need to append it to that. Whatever you need to append another element to that.
Yep. So we'll just append it as a child.
Mhm.
Perfect. All right. So let's do this. So instead of re-grabbing the div every single time we do the loop, which we could do, but we can just grab it once because the div's not going to change. So let's go ahead and say that this is going to be list container div. And how can we grab something by its ID? Does anyone remember? We did this a couple of lines ago,
Nicole,
somewhere
you
else in
got
the
it.
code.
Oh, someone other than Nicole.
The document get element by ID.
Perfect. There we go. Yes. So document got element by ID. This time we're going to go with Nicole's original suggestion of list container, because that is now the correct answer. If I can figure out how to get to, okay, I'm just going to click it. List container. There we go. All right. So now that's still grayed out. So now we need to append it, the user div, as a child. How do I append something as a child?
We're appending it
Joe.
to the main here. Is that
So we're
main, right? So main dot append child.
Yep, so or in this case, it'd be list container div
Oh.
dot append child. Isn't it great that there's a function written out that's exactly titled the exact same thing as was in our pseudocode? That's crazy. I wonder how that happened. So let's add in user div. Then again, I'll just write down appends user div as a child to list container. Last thing we need to do is we should probably actually run this function because we aren't running it right now. So let's do that right where we're saying display that data. So let's say draw users, and then we're going to input user data. And that should be about it. So what before we test it, let's take a look at what we've done. So we started out by writing out our button listener that when you click the button, a thing happens. We then decided when we click the button, we want to retrieve data from our API. So we created that get users from API function that does a simple fetch request, get your data back, process it as JSON. This is an async function because it has to wait for all of these steps to finish. And when we run an async function inside another function, we have to wait for it to finish and then put that inside of another async. So we end up wrapping our async in an async. We then decided, all right, when we run, well, that's great. We get JSON out. We need to figure out how to display JSON. So we wrote up our create user element, which turns JSON for one user into a div for one user. But one user is not what we're getting back. We're getting back like 15 users. So we had to iterate through our JSON, get out all the users individually, and then as we do that, we can append those divs to our list container div. And that goes the last step in our button list. So let's see this thing in action. Let's see if this actually works or not. If it doesn't, we'll pretend it did. So if we click show users, take a look at that. Our button is clicked. And, well, the one thing I will say is it probably wasn't the best idea to write list placeholder in here because that didn't get overwritten. The reason it didn't get overwritten is because we just kept on appending to whatever was in the div. We never like wiped it clean. So if I were to remove list placeholder and we rerun it, now it'll be blank. And as we see, we have our individual devs here. So we have our divs. So we have the user's name, the username, and the town. And that keeps going for all of them. And it's pretty decently formatted. So in conclusion, that's how we get from a bunch of user specifications written out here to writing the HTML code to pseudocoding the JavaScript, which is the most important step as somebody wrote out here. And then lastly, actually writing the JavaScript code and testing. Questions about what we did today in terms of clicking a button and using it to pull things from an API and formatting it well. All right, so let's stop the